Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of AP US Lectures this year. This year, we're talking about something we haven't talked about a lot, as some of the previous speakers have already talked about. We are talking about the world in relationship to the United States. Yes, I'm using props today. For the first time since Washington, the United States has had a foreign policy. And this is important because obviously foreign policy is going to be critical to the United States in the 20th century. As you've just heard, Roosevelt had a very clear foreign policy. Taft and Wilson both changed up on Roosevelt's initial foreign policy. And that's important to understand that there are three different foreign policies during this time period. And you see elements of all three of them throughout the 20th century, which we'll talk about. All right. So first of all, Taft focused on dollar diplomacy. Okay. So great cartoon here up in the top. Taft is putting away Roosevelt's big stick policy and telling businessmen, I want you to go out and invest. However, the hidden idea there is that the U.S. military will still back them up. This was especially important in Central and South America. All right. He wanted the United States to basically use their financial advantage to gain favor in these countries, help them build roads, telegraph wires, and other infrastructure to basically make these countries better in return for letting those American companies basically set up shop in those companies. And that's going to help, as you can see on this chart, half of all global investments in the United States during Taft's time is invested in Latin and South America. All right. Some of this is also invested in Asia, which is also going to be opening. Remember the open door policy that had happened before. All right. I would argue that this is the number one of the three diplomacies that is used throughout the 20th century. This is why you see Microsoft. This is why you see Apple. This is why you see IBM. This is why you see Starbucks with international headquarters all over the world. This is why American brands become global brands because of dollar diplomacy. All right. Now there was the use of the military still. So you still see elements of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy. Probably the worst example of this under Taft was the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government in 1911. U.S. Marines will basically stay in Nicaragua from 1911 until 1935, which is an all-out invasion of the country. The new Chinese Republic, which started in that year, Taft really wanted to make sure that the United States got into that, so he encouraged, again, more investments in China. All right, one thing that really threw off Taft's policies was the Lodge Corollary, which is very important. Henry Cabot Lodge will become one of the most powerful senators over the next 10 years. And early on, he was a friend of Roosevelt's, which probably had something to do with it. He basically passed a resolution in Congress called the Lodge Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that said that not only European powers, which were already kind of part of the Monroe Doctrine, but non-European powers could not own territory in the Western Hemisphere. Again, this was our backyard, okay? The Western Hemisphere was the U.S. backyard, and we did not want anybody coming in there. Japan had wanted to purchase a large tract of land from Mexico, and the Lodge Corollary forbid it. This made other countries begin to distrust Taft's belief in dollar diplomacy. All right, Wilson comes in and he fundamentally changes big stick and dollar diplomacy, and he says we are going to look at the world through moral eyes. Now, good news, bad news. In some ways, Wilson was a somewhat moral individual, but unfortunately, in his idea, it was the definition of what he saw as moral, and this is where it kind of went astray. He basically only wanted to help governments that wanted to be democracies. They had to be like the U.S., and he would economically punish them if they weren't like the U.S. Again, this revolved a lot around mostly Central America. And of course, you had to abide by Wilson's morals. Now, there were some successes to this. All right. Some of the earlier problems with big stick policy, such as the Philippines and such as Puerto Rico, Wilson actually solved. So Puerto Ricans under Wilson got U.S. citizenship. This is a huge step. Puerto Ricans are still U.S. citizens today in the United States. All right. In the Philippines, which we treated horribly for 10 years, basically had a unknown guerrilla war there for over 10 years. Wilson passed the Jones Act, which basically gave the Philippines autonomy and promised them their own government once they were ready. This obviously will not happen until after World War II, but he at least tried to make amends for some of the force that was provided early on under the Roosevelt administration. However, he had his own problems, especially in Central America. Wilson used more military interventions than Taft and Roosevelt combined, especially in Central America, places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Mexico. All right. He actually seized the city of Veracruz because of the Tampico incident. He didn't like that a dictator took over there. And basically, he wanted to impose American morality on a lot of these Central American countries. All right. And then finally, this is a great cartoon, famous cartoon. You can see that the countries like Nicaragua and Mexico are being treated like children. Roosevelt is the teacher. He was actually a professor before he became president. And notice the quote, which is kind of funny in light of some of the things going on today, but basically he's teaching them how to be democratic. And it's kind of like this moral aptitude. All right. If you look, guys, at the foreign policy of the past 100 years in this country, there is an element of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy. There's a big element of Taft's dollar diplomacy, and there's an element of Wilson's moral diplomacy. The three of these are going to kind of combine into what becomes American foreign policy in the 20th century. And obviously, Wilson's going to have a lot more on his plate once World War I breaks out, which we'll talk about next week. All right. And then finally, you can't leave Wilson without he basically loses it in regards to Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa basically invades the United States. He basically uses Mexico because he's a bandito. And as you can see, the Mexicans would not do anything about him. And so Wilson actually sent the American army into Mexico to track down Pancho Villa. This is clearly a intervention and not regarding the neutrality of Mexico. So moral diplomacy turned into force. And again, you see the elements of big stick diplomacy. All right. So very important to understand that we are getting into more foreign policy in the 20th century and how the United States reacts with the rest of the world. Thanks, guys.